Welcome to the Demonstrating Implementation Excellence stream of the SNOMED CT Expo 2021. My name is Leilei Zhu and I'm a Senior Terminologist at SNOMED International, and I'm really pleased to be introducing today's session. Please use the live Q&A on your AirTouch device to type any questions you have for the presenters. All questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. I'm now very pleased to introduce Dr. Wai-Kyung Wong and Leilei Zhu from University College London Hospital's NHS Foundation Trust. They will be presenting the transition to SNOMED CT as the interface terminology in a large EHR system. Wai-Kyung and Leilei, please proceed.
Thank you, Elaine. So hi, everyone. I'm Wai-Kyung. I'm a hematology consultant and Chief Research Information Officer at UCLH, a large academic hospital in the center of London. And myself and Leilei will be telling you about our journey on how we transition to SNOMED CT in our EHR system. Really excited to share this journey with you because we think for our particular vendor, our Epic EHR, we're the first English-speaking site in the world to have done this transition. But first, we'll give you a little bit of background on how we record diagnosis in our EHR, why we initially chose to go with a proprietary interface terminology system during our implementation, and why we decided to then transition away from this to use native SNOMED CT, and then how we did it. So a little bit of background to start with. So UCLH implemented a fully integrated electronic health record system called Epic in March 2019, moving us from quite a digitally immature paper-based organization to a fully paperless organization about 2.5 years ago. Like most EHRs, Epic provides a persistent problem list and encounter-specific coded diagnosis entry facility. The screenshot there shows a typical problem list for a patient listing 2 specific diagnoses. Clinicians have a choice to pick these diagnostic terms from a long list of diagnosis terms. So this is what we call the interface terminology, is the list of terms that are provided to clinicians to choose from to add to the problem list. What actually happens in the background is that these terms, like in this case, autoimmune neutropenia, is then mapped in the background to actual concepts. In this case, showing you the SNOMED CT concept and the equivalent ICD-10 concept. So just to reiterate, what you see on the screen in the problem list is a diagnostic term linked in the background to diagnostic concepts. And it may or may not be called the same thing in whatever language it might be. But just a reminder that the diagnosis term is just one aspect of recording a diagnosis. All the term does is tell you what diagnosis it is. It doesn't tell you when the diagnosis was recorded, whether it's a chronic problem, or otherwise. So just to kind of emphasize, as most of the audience would know anyway, I hope, that the terminology is only one aspect of trying to record a diagnosis. So in the UK NHS, the NHS Digital, which is a central organization that mandates standards, have always mandated the use of SNOMED CT in the NHS. But one thing is interesting, it doesn't actually specifically define the depth of use itself. So by definition, because even though we don't use SNOMED CT terms in the front end, but map to SNOMED CT, we are by definition already compliant. So just a reminder here, because I think it's really important for this presentation, the list of terms is called the interface terminology, and the thing that is mapped to in the background that provides the knowledge linking. For example, the fact that it will know that non-ST elevation MI is a type of myocardial infarction is the reference terminology, and Epic uses SNOMED CT already for that purpose. So if we always intended to use SNOMED CT as our interface terminology system so that clinicians directly interact with SNOMED CT instead of mapping it in the background, why did we not implement this at Go Live? Well, the first reason is this has never been done in the Epic EHR before. So we had 2 options. We could generate a list of terms from SNOMED CT, because this is widely published, but we would have to convert the kind of RF2 files that's provided as part of the SNOMED CT release into a format that can be ingested into our electronic health record system. Or we could buy from a third party a product that provides this list of clinical terms and that has been used before in EPIC, which then in the background is mapped to SNOMED CT. Now, we had very little time to make this diagnosis, so we chose to go, this option, so we chose to go to option 2. The main reason for this is because nearly all English language EPIC implementation uses EPIC's default terminology system. And with the exception of 2 very large US institutions, which have very large, if you like, terminology teams, something that we did not have at UCLH at the beginning. And as a lot of you know, a lot of the problem list content and the diagnosis is extremely fundamental to the functioning of any EHRs. So a lot of derivatives of the diagnosis file, for example, decision support or reporting groupers, are defined using that particular dictionary, if you like, already. In fact, when EPIC provided us with the foundation system to build upon, the third-party content was already in it. And because we had no capability or knowledge at the time on how we would replace this, we decided to go for option 2. Otherwise, we would have delayed our implementation. Now, just a general comment about mapping. So in this case, mapping between a third-party interface terminology system to SNOMED CT. The one thing that's quite interesting that in EPIC itself, most of the logic that is used to drive decision support that has diagnosis as a criteria actually uses the SNOMED CT concept that is mapped and the associated hierarchy and not the actual term itself. And it's also the SNOMED CT concept ID that is used in information exchange when we send information out of UCLH, for example, to our primary care practitioners, to the health information exchange, and for reporting purposes, like a lot of the national returns that we have to do. And as most of you know here, every time we try to move from one terminology system to another, even with the best efforts and in a perfect world, there's always a change in meaning, or at least a risk in the change in meaning. And I will now hand over to my colleague, Leilei, who will take you through some of the issues that we've encountered with using a third-party interface terminology system.
Hi. I just happen to have 2 screens, so I'm just looking at my monitor, big monitor now. So we got the first issue after go live that we soon discovered is the inaccuracy of the mapping. What we actually did is we randomly selected 2,000 diagnoses and jointly with our proprietary supplier, and then see the error rate. And then the error rate is around, mapping error rate is around 7% to 8%. I'm here listed some of the errors that we discovered, like, non-STEMI, it was mapped as marketing function, but actually in SNOMED CT, we do have a concept, which basically is non-STEMI. And then acid reflux, it mapped to gastroesophageal reflux disease, but actually there is a SNOMED CT concept also for acid reflux. I mean, these errors may well be fixed now, but this is just the situation when we discovered it. Next slide, please. And the second issue, what we discovered is the content. I think everybody who's using SNOMED CT in NHS knows that in the UK, SNOMED CT actually contains 2 big chunks. One is the international call. The other is the SNOMED CT UK content. We soon discovered that the mapping from the third-party company only mapped to the SNOMED CT international call. This has significantly affected a lot of our data submission because, for example, our ED emergency data set has got a diagnosis, quite a few diagnoses mapped to the SNOMED CT UK edition, and then we were unable to submit those valid SNOMED CT codes. So what we had to do is create manually another mapping table within our EPIC system to get over those mapping issues. It was actually quite a tedious task to do. Next slide, please. The third issue is the delay in terminology release. During the pandemic, I think both SNOMED CT International and UK Release Center quickly released quite a lot of the concepts related to COVID-19. But because the proprietary product have to do the mapping after the release, so there is always a delay there. It wasn't really supporting a turnaround required during the pandemic. So there was one release that was quite a bit delay with it. Next one, please. The fourth issue is the company not only provided the mapping to SNOMED CT, but also provided the mapping to ICD-10. Our coders, our coding colleagues in EPIC uses a 3M medical product to feed the HRG grouper. So what we soon discovered is they didn't feel that the ICD-10 mapping actually corresponds with the UK coding practice. So we had a function and then developed within EPIC to automatically show the coding colleagues the mapped ICD-10 codes from the terminology that clinician recorded, but we soon have to turn it off because they felt that there were quite a lot of the wrong mappings about ICD-10. Next, please. Fifth issue would be the interoperability with other applications. We have won the NHSX AI award to develop an NLP, which is natural language processing engine, that will be able to integrate with EPIC and other EHR systems. So naturally, NLP engines would use SNOMED CT as the data standards to underpin it. But with the proprietary system, which is quite challenging to integrate because the mapping was only supposed to be used one way, but when an NLP engine pick up the data standard in SNOMED CT, it somehow has to map it to the interface terminology, and the screen can be quite messy, and then there's normally a long terms for clinicians to select. That's one more step for the clinicians to do. It doesn't integrate very cleanly. And we also have a platform called the clinical trials. We also annotated with SNOMED CT concept. We kind of encountered the similar issues. Next one, please. The other issue we wanted to flag up here is in our EPIC system, we try to use one language throughout for the clinical terms. So for our surgical procedures and radiology procedures, we use SNOMED CT. We also intended to move to use SNOMED CT to standardize our lab procedures and results components. We basically want to minimize the number of ontology systems that's in use. So we feel like, it's like the reason to introduce a central EHR system is to consolidate all the island department IT systems. So likewise, we also want to consolidate all the different ways of describe clinical content and stick with one terminology system. Next, please. So we made a proposal to remove the third-party terminology system and transition to SNOMED CT. So how it looks like is on the left-hand side, which was how it happens and the process it happens in EPIC. So we have a EDG file, which is for diagnosis. We also have the SNOMED CT content. So we now instantly have two terminology systems, and we have a mapping file, which we call EXM in between, which maps the proprietary terminology system to SNOMED CT. And we also have the ICD-10 mapping provided by the third party. So now by removing the third-party product and then transition directly to SNOMED CT, we remove that mapping layer. Well, strictly speaking, we didn't remove the mapping layer because it's actually one-to-one mapping now. It's literally SNOMED CT mapped to SNOMED CT. And for our ICD-10 mapping file, we basically adopted NHS Digital's ICD-10 mapping file. So we feel it's a lot cleaner, and we removed that unnecessary layer in the middle. Next, please. Okay, so the next section, we are going to talk about how did we transition and what's the methodology that we actually undertook. So basically, there are two major tasks involved in this project. One is, how do we use SNOMED CT to populate the diagnosis master file? How do we create that one? And the other one is, we've already gone live. By the time we made the transition, how we are going to handle the historical patient data. With the first one, we created a utility and convert the SNOMED CT file, which was distributed on TRAD. TRAD is the UK NHS central file distribution service. We basically transferred that RF2 file into the format that Epic's master file took to make it compatible. We didn't feel this one is very challenging, and we feel like with a good understanding about SNOMED CT content and a good understanding about Epic's master file content, it's not that difficult to do. The thing we find most challenging would be handling the existing problem entries. You know, we wanted to be really careful, like not to make the wrong replacement. So basically, we went with two categories. One is some of the diagnoses, we just left it as it is. And then when clinicians try to update that diagnosis, the Epic system would prompt a message prompting the clinician to change it. So the clinicians manually change it. So that's one way of doing this. And these ones are the ones we didn't feel that there's a safe one-to-one match. The other one is the batch convert. We basically, those ones is we kind of convert many diagnoses in one go to SNOMED CT concepts. We actually aim to convert majority of the diagnoses in one go if we can, because we didn't want that prompt to show up all the time, because it's quite interruptive sometimes during the workflow for clinicians. Next slide, please. So how do we do the safe replacement for the historical data, which is, we put the word mapping here, which is basically a replacement. And firstly, we felt like 7 to 8% mapping error is not, is less than optimal. So we wanted to make sure that every single term is reviewed properly. So what we did is we did use some script. We created some fuzzy match algorithm to identify the terms with similar or the same wording or the synonyms. And then, so if hypertension in the third-party supply is called hypertension, and then in SNOMED CT, we also have one called hypertension, then we believe that's a one-to-one straightforward batch replacement. But for the ones that it's not exactly the same wording, what we did is we made sure that there are clinical input into this. So each one term had been reviewed by two clinicians and also terminologists. This whole review process is probably the element that took the longest time to complete. It took about 6 to 8 months. But as I said, we really had to be extremely careful about treating each historical diagnosis, in a very, very, very careful manner. We also engaged all our EHR, electronic health record analysts, to involve them in a thorough testing and validation process to ensure that we don't lose any Epic functionalities due to this transition. For example, all the clinical decision support alerts can be triggered, and it's now still safely triggered. And then the patient safety risk is reduced to minimal. Next slide, please. So the result is we have, by the time we did the transition, we have 45,000, nearly 46 distinct diagnoses were recorded. We automatically mapped to SNOMED CT term with 21,980 of them. And so there are 33,000 of them requires manual review. And that's why that 6 to 8 months came into play. And overall, patient-wise, we were able to, diagnosis volume-wise, we were able to match 68.5% of distinctive diagnosis terms. And then that's in total 95.6 all diagnosis entries in the EHR. This 95.6% include the ones that after manual review, we feel it's a safe replacement. So we made the transition successfully on April the 7th this year. And during the meantime, we did find more mapping errors, and one mapping error affected, around 200 patients. And any errors that we discovered, we corrected them manually. Next, please. So we found that with a good understanding of SNOMED CT release file structure and content, coupled with the SQL and Python skills, populating the EDG master file with SNOMED CT is not a difficult task. There has been no loss of functionality for our system. And then the clinical user testing had been relatively positive. Because the proprietary system is terms-based, but SNOMED CT is concept-based. So with this transition, we kind of did a reduction of the choice of terms by clinicians from nearly 500,000 terms to 120,000 concepts. I will show example, later on. We also feel that we are able to work with Epic to provide an option for future customers to be able to select the terminology system that they feel most appropriate for their situation. And we are currently working with the Epic development team to create a utility for automated process of SNOMED CT import and maintenance. And so the future site could have also don't have to do this manually. And we wanted that utility to be done in an automatic way. Next, please. So this is an example. I think it's quite small to see. I don't know whether everyone can see it. Yeah, is it possible to make it a bit bigger, please? Okay, so basically, I'll just explain. So as a clinician, I type in DVT, right? It's a commonly typed keyword for search. So this is with the old system, this is the first page that shows up. I've got DVT of different body site. Next, please. And it continues on with with the second page, which has the keyword of DVT. I think that by now the clinician would already feel it's too much to select. Next, please. So when we transition to SNOMED CT, we type in DVT, and then that's all the terms that actually shows up. And then, coincidentally and luckily, and then we kind of configured it in a way that to make sure that the DVT term shows on the top. So it's quite, you can see it's quite the selection list is much shorter now. We have many examples like this. This is just one example. Next, please. Okay, so post-implementation, now we probably like 6 months now into since we transitioned, and it's not like a perfect scenario, and we did experience issues, but all the issues are expected, and I think it's probably the common issue that SNOMED CT community talk about frequently as well. We got the content that contains gaps, particularly UCLH has got some very highly specialized areas of medicine. And we since then made quite a bit like requests to our NHS, release terminology release centers. Then the content is not consistent. The most recent one I discovered is, my clinician raised to me is, well, we have a term called metastatic colon cancer, but why don't we have a term called metastatic breast cancer? And then, my oncologist who specializes in breast cancer isn't very happy about this. And then the third issue would be, what is exactly the preferred name? Which should be the preferred name? And but some of them sometimes they feel the term is rather archaic, and it's a historical way of calling things. And I think that things have moved on. We don't use this term anymore, but why it's still active in SNOMED CT. So I think these are the other common expected issues. But we also discovered some non-technical issues, and which I feel also kind of expected, which is human behavior didn't really change with the terminology change. We moved to SNOMED CT, but we didn't really fundamentally resolve the issue of getting clinicians all happily embrace this idea of structured data and happily input the structured data within the electronic health record system. So, we still have quite a lot of clinicians do free text typing, all the way, rather than putting things in those structured right pockets. But I think this kind of forced our trust to have to think about, be more innovative and think about other ways of filling data fields, of filling data gaps in EHRs. Do we still try to wait until one day that structured data inputting is going to happen, or do we think about some other ways that we might be able to do to mitigate this data incomplete risk? So that's the implementation issues I think that we would like to share with the group here. I'm going to hand over to Waikiang now to conclude this.
Thank you, Leilei. So, ladies and gentlemen, you've heard from the lady that actually did all the work. So, but I get the benefit of closing. So, I hope we've demonstrated that SNOMED CT can indeed be used successfully as an interface terminology system. We are seeing a lot of benefits already. Some may not be obvious to the end user, but a lot of the we've highly simplified the terminology version control because you only get it from one source. Almost immediately, we improved our interoperability capability. Lots of the projects that we do on creating apps to plug into our EHR immediately started working after the transition. The flow of data from end to end is just much more accurate, and we have full control over it. And we also hope to use this project as a springboard for better clinical engagement. I think it's really quite nice for some of our clinicians to see that SNOMED CT recognizes some of the procedures or diagnoses they actually treat, and they can see how by engaging, with just the EHR team at UCLH, they are actually influencing how colleagues in lots right across the UK and perhaps and even internationally in their areas of interest. And finally, just a comment, especially during implementation. By the way, it's much easier to do this at implementation and not transition like what we did. Carefully consider the trade-offs of using a different system for your interface terminology rather than just going, if you like, natively with SNOMED. So with that, I'd like to thank you for listening and happy to take any questions.
Okay, well, thank you, Leilei and Waikiang, for sharing your experiences. That was really interesting, in particular the issues with UK integration and mapping historical content. Very interesting issues. So now to the questions. Can I just ask that you give us a moment while we switch over from our pre-recorded content so Leilei and Waikiang can address the questions you've been submitting live. Just to note as well, the session will be available on the event platform for the next 3 months. So feel free to go back and visit it or learn something new. Hello everyone. Yes, we're live now. We've not got a lot of time for questions, so I'll go straight into them. We've got one from Mikhail. How different are the terms in your interface terminology to the corresponding SNOMED CT preferred terms in general?
Leilei, do you want to take that one? Oh. Okay, I'll have a go. So there are situations where the terms in the old interface terminology system is exactly the same, and they made it very easy to transition. But it's quite hard to answer that question because we've gone from a situation that were 500,000 individual terms down to 125,000. And really the main differences are in terms perhaps of the level of pre-coordination. So a lot of these SNOMED concepts are not pre-coordinated, whereas in our previous system they were. So that was one big difference. The second thing was the content of the previous system as well contained a lot of, if you like, non-clinical diagnoses that includes things like morphological diagnoses, whereas when we updated it to native SNOMED CT, we did not load that particular aspect of SNOMED CT. And slightly unsurprisingly as well, that there was some kind of more rare disease or certain eponymous names and stuff that may not be available in SNOMED CT. So hopefully that kind of addresses the question of the differences. But clinically, our colleagues have been quite accepting of the change, and there hasn't been a kind of practical issue.
Excellent. I think we've got time for one more question. We'll overrun a little bit, but I think that's fine. Marie's asked, Marie Alexander has asked, 8% of mapping errors is terrifying, meaning that in 8% the medical information exchange isn't what the doctor meant to say. Any idea of the clinical risk that was involved with those errors? Are they mitigated by sending always the term selected by the clinician along with the SNOMED CT concept map to it when exchanging, displaying data?
Yeah, this is a great question. Just to say that in the 8% error rate includes things that are not completely wrong, if you like. It just could be that the mapped concept is less specific than what the clinician intended. And I think the majority fell in the kind of less specific. There were better choices that it could have been mapped to, but it was mapped to something more general. But there were circumstances where it's wrong. And it is mitigated somewhat that when we exchange our data with external organizations, the display name, if you like, of the origin system is showed. So that does mitigate it somewhat. Not very useful for computability, but useful for human readability.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Excellent presentation. I'm afraid we lost Leilei somewhere along the line, but no, never mind. Thanks again. If anyone has any additional questions, I'd encourage you to connect via the meeting hub. So thanks for joining us and enjoy the rest of the expo. Bye.
Thank you.